Hey guys, tonight we're setting sail with the Viking seafarers, plunging into the icy waters of the North Atlantic to explore what they ate on their long, grueling voyages. You're standing on the deck of a stout, cargo-laden vessel creaking under the weight of salted fish, barrels of ale, and enough dried meat to feed a crew of restless warriors. The air is sharp with the scent of salt and wood tar. Wind howls through the rigging, and waves slap against the hull with a steady, rhythmic thud. It's cold. Bitterly cold. You pull your woolen cloak tighter, but it's never quite enough to keep out that relentless chill. Out here, surrounded by nothing but the churning gray sea, the question of what you'll eat takes on a whole new urgency. You can't just pop below deck and whip up a warm meal. The Nar has no galley, no stove, no fire. Food must be pre-prepared, and it must last. That's why the crew spent days salting, drying, and smoking provisions before departure. It's the Viking way. They don't just hunt and fish, they prepare. And when you're facing weeks, maybe months, at sea, you have to prepare for the worst. Your ration for the day includes a slab of salted cod. It's tough as leather and twice as salty, but that's exactly the point. Salt draws out moisture, preventing the growth of bacteria and preserving the fish for weeks on end. To eat it, you first soak it in a wooden bucket of seawater to soften it up. The crew jokes that it's like chewing on a boot, but it's food. It keeps you alive. Alongside the cod, you tear into a chunk of hardtack, a dense, rock-hard biscuit made of barley flour and water. The biscuit is so dry it could double as a weapon. You crack it open with a knife and gnaw on the edges, feeling the grit between your teeth. If you're lucky, it hasn't developed any weevils yet.
But even if it has, well, the weevils are just extra protein, right?
As you eat, you look around at your shipmates. The men are huddled in small groups, talking quietly. Some are sharpening their weapons, others are just staring blankly at the sea. Everyone's conserving their energy, keeping their minds off the endless gray horizon and the taste of salt that seems to cling to everything. The captain, a burly man with a tangled beard and a scar that stretches from ear to chin, walks the deck with a watchful eye. He's clutching a wooden cup filled with watered-down ale. Not enough to get drunk, just enough to keep warm and stay sane. The ale is thin, bitter, and slightly sour, but it's safer to drink than seawater and better than nothing. You take another bite of hardtack and try to swallow. It scrapes down your throat like gravel. You chase it with a swig of ale, letting the liquid wash away the crumbs. The salt stings your cracked lips. You close your eyes and imagine a feast back home, roasted lamb, fresh bread, honey-sweetened porridge. But out here, those memories only make the hunger worse. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know where you're listening from and what time it is. Maybe you're already drifting off, imagining the creak of the ship and the relentless crash of the waves. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're just getting started, and the sea is only going to get rougher. You wake up to the sound of gulls cawing overhead and the steady creak of wood beneath you. The Nar rocks gently, and the salty air stings your eyes as you sit up and stretch. Your back is sore from sleeping on the wooden deck, and your stomach grumbles with a hunger that never quite goes away. Today, it's time to raid the provisions chest again. But before you get too excited, remember, the food on a Viking ship isn't exactly a feast. It's survival fare, and that means a lot of dried, salted, and smoked everything. In the days before departure, the entire crew gathered around open fires, laying out fish and meat to be preserved. The smoke swirled thick and gray, seeping into every crevice of the flesh. Fish was hung on wooden racks, its skin slowly hardening until it felt like armor. This wasn't your average fish fillet. It was stockfish, fish that had been hung up to dry for days, sometimes weeks. By the time it's ready, it's hard as a plank of wood and smells like the ocean. To eat it, you take a club or the blunt end of your knife and pound it until it loosened up enough to chew. If you're lucky, you've got a little bit of whale blubber or seal fat to slather on top. It's greasy and gamey, but it's also packed with the fat and calories you desperately need to survive in these frigid waters. Meat was another story. The Vikings weren't picky, they smoked everything from pork to reindeer to horse meat. The smoke infused the meat with a deep, acrid taste that lingered on your tongue for hours. And while it may not have been the most appetizing meal, it was better than the alternative, rotting flesh. Salt was the ultimate preservative. When meat or fish couldn't be smoked, it was salted heavily and packed into barrels. The salt drew out moisture, effectively mummifying the meat. And while it kept food from spoiling, it also made every bite feel like chewing on a mouthful of sand. But out here, salt was a precious resource. If the crew ran low, they'd have to resort to other, less effective methods of preservation, like drying fish in the open air, where gulls and rats might get to it first. You take a bite of your salted cod and grimace as the briny taste floods your mouth. There's a reason the Vikings drank so much ale. It wasn't just for the buzz, it was to wash down the relentless, unchanging taste of salted meat and fish. As you chew, you glance around the deck. One of your shipmates is busy tying knots in the rigging, but he keeps pausing to spit over the side. His lips are dry and cracked. Dehydration is a constant threat, especially with all the salt you're consuming. There's fresh water aboard, but it's rationed carefully. Once it runs out, there's no telling when you'll get more. You take a sip from your wooden cup. The water is stale and slightly brackish.
You try not to think about how long it's been sitting in that barrel, festering in the heat and rolling with the waves.
You close your eyes, letting the rhythm of the ship rock you back and forth, back and forth. And then you hear it, a shout from the bow. Fish! Fish on the line! Everyone springs into action, rushing toward the edge of the ship where a line is strung tight, quivering with the weight of a struggling fish. The fisherman hauls it in, and you all watch as a fat, writhing cod is pulled aboard. Fresh fish. It's a rare treat. The crew gathers around as the fisherman guts the cod, slicing it open with a swift, practiced motion. The air fills with the metallic scent of fresh blood and seawater. The fish is divided up quickly, each man receiving a small, raw piece. You chew yours slowly, savoring the taste of something that hasn't been salted, dried, or smoked into oblivion. It's a moment of relief, a reminder of what real food tastes like. And as the wind picks up and the ship creaks beneath your feet, you close your eyes and let yourself imagine the feasts that wait back home. Roasted boar. Fresh bread. Mead that hasn't been watered down. But for now, you'll settle for your salty cod and a wooden cup of stale water. Because out here, every bite is a battle, and every meal is a victory. Your eyes snap open to the hollow thud of waves slamming against the hull. You sit up, your back aching from another night on the hard, damp deck. The morning air is sharp, biting through your woolen cloak.
You shiver, rubbing your hands together as your shipmates stir awake, each one wrapped tightly in blankets that still smell like smoke from the last night ashore.
Today's breakfast? Gruel. Again. A crewmate crouches over a wooden pot, stirring a thick, gluey mixture of oats and water. The gruel is a pale, unappealing gray, flecked with bits of crushed barley. It's cold, congealed into a sludge that wobbles when he spoons it out. You get your portion in a wooden bowl, the edges splintering from weeks of use. You dip a finger into the mush and taste it. Bland. Gritty. A hint of sourness from the oat flour that started to turn. But it's food, and it fills your belly. That's what matters. Gruel is the backbone of every Viking voyage. It's simple to make and easy to store, requiring just two things, grain and water. Both are precious commodities on board, especially grain, which is stored in tightly sealed barrels to keep out rats and moisture. You eat it twice a day, every day, and it never changes. Sometimes, if you're lucky, someone will toss in a scrap of dried meat or a dollop of seal fat to make it a little more interesting.
But today, it's just oats and water.
You glance to your left and spot Eric, a burly man with a beard thick enough to hide a small bird. He's chewing slowly, staring out at the horizon with a blank, distant look. You nudge him, offering your bowl. Want some more? He shakes his head, swallowing with a grimace. Had enough to last a lifetime, he mutters. Across the deck, another crewman, young, wiry, his eyes sunken with fatigue, holds up a piece of flatbread. It's round, thin, and as hard as a stone. Hardtack. The Vikings call it skonbrod, meaning thin bread. You've been gnawing on the same piece for days, and it still feels like chewing through bark. Skonbrod is a staple on Viking ships. Made from barley flour, water, and little else, it's baked until every drop of moisture is sucked out. That's what keeps it from spoiling. It's so dry that it could sit in a storage barrel for months without going bad. The downside? It's practically indestructible. To eat it, you have to dip it in water, soften it up with a little ale, or smash it with a rock until it's at least somewhat chewable. You take a piece of skonbrod and tap it against the deck. It echoes like a drum. You grin and take a bite. It's like chewing on a chunk of wood, and it crumbles to a dry, powdery mess in your mouth. You chase it with a gulp of water, the taste of grain and stale wood mingling on your tongue. As you chew, your mind wanders. You think back to that one time in Norway when you had bread fresh from the hearth, still warm and soft, slathered with goat cheese and honey. You close your eyes, imagining the sweetness, the richness. But then the wind picks up, stinging your face with icy spray, and the fantasy slips away. Your captain strides by, his heavy boots thudding against the wooden planks. He's carrying a small wooden chest, a food reserve. When he opens it, a puff of stale air rises.
Inside are a few more rounds of skonbrod, some dried fish wrapped in cloth, and a jar of fermented herring.
The herring is sealed tight, and for good reason. When the lid is pried off, a smell hits you like a punch to the gut. Sour. Rotting. Almost fishy cheese. It's rackfisk, fermented fish that's been left to stew in its own juices for months. You watch as the captain pinches his nose, takes a bite, and chews grimly. The rest of the crew grimaces, but no one says a word. You all know the drill. Food is food, no matter how it smells or tastes. You reach for another chunk of skonbrod, holding it up to the gray sky as a gull screeches overhead. You tear off a piece and chew, jaw working like a millstone as you grind it down. It's dry. Tasteless. But it's what keeps you alive. And out here, survival is the only flavor that matters. The wind whips through the rigging as the Nar plows through the choppy sea. You're huddled against the mast, shoulders hunched, eyes squinting against the spray. Your teeth ache from gnawing on another slab of salted cod, the same meal you had yesterday, and the day before that. But today, something different is in the air. A smell. A pungent, eye-watering, unmistakable stench that drifts from the bow. You already know what it is. Rackfisk. Fermented fish. Eric, the burly man with the beard thick enough to nest a family of sparrows, is hunched over a wooden barrel, prying open the lid with a knife. As the top pops off, a sour, almost rancid aroma floods the deck. Heads turn. Noses wrinkle. Someone gags. But Eric just grins, his yellowed teeth gleaming in the pale light. Rackfisk is an acquired taste, to put it lightly. It's fish that's been packed in salt and left to ferment in its own juices for weeks, sometimes months. The result is a slippery, gelatinous mass that smells like a mix of rotten eggs and ocean sludge. But to the Vikings, it's a delicacy. And, more importantly, it's a source of protein that doesn't need a fire to cook. You shuffle forward, joining the small group of sailors gathered around the barrel. Eric spears a hunk of the fish with his knife and lifts it to his mouth, the slimy flesh quivering as he bites down. The scent is overwhelming. Your stomach churns. You remember the last time you ate rackfisk, how the taste lingered for hours, clinging to your tongue like a bad memory. But out here, food is food. You take your turn, accepting a piece from Eric's knife. The flesh is cold and oily, with a texture like wet clay. You chew, forcing yourself to swallow as the sour, briny taste floods your mouth. It's sharp. Almost metallic. The tang of rot lingers at the back of your throat. Around you, the other men are chewing just as grimly, eyes squinting as they work the fish down. It's a test of endurance, a reminder that Viking sailors are made of sterner stuff than most. Historians still argue whether rackfisk started as a preservation method or a dare, Eric says, wiping his knife on his tunic. But my grandfather swore it was a gift from Odin himself. You snort. A gift? More like a punishment. Eric laughs, clapping you on the back so hard you nearly choke. But there's a strange sort of camaraderie in the misery. Out here, where the sea stretches endlessly and the days blur into each other, even something as foul as rackfisk can be a bonding experience. Later, as the sun sinks lower in the sky, you watch as the captain pulls out another barrel. This one is filled with lutefisk, dried whitefish that's been soaked in lye until it turns into a gelatinous, translucent slab. It quivers in his hands as he slices off pieces with a bone-handled knife, passing them around. Lutefisk is another Viking staple, beloved for its long shelf life and sheer weirdness. To make it, you take dried fish, soak it in water for days, then dunk it in a lye solution until it swells up like a sponge. The end result is a fish that's half solid, half gooey, and all weird. You accept a piece, holding it up to the fading light. It's pale and slimy, like something that washed ashore after a storm. You bite down, and it dissolves in your mouth like fish-flavored jelly. It tastes like seawater, with a faint, soapy aftertaste from the lye. But it's filling, and out here, that's all that matters. You wipe your mouth with the back of your hand and stare out at the horizon. The sky is darkening, streaked with clouds that hang heavy and low. The waves have grown choppier, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbles. You clutch your cloak tighter, shivering as the wind picks up. The cold seeps into your bones, mingling with the sour taste of fermented fish. You close your eyes, letting the rocking of the ship lull you into a kind of trance. You imagine being back home, sitting by a roaring fire with a bowl of warm porridge in your hands. The scent of fresh bread fills the air, and the taste of honey dances on your tongue. But then a gust of wind jolts you back to reality, and all you can smell is rackfisk and lutefisk and the endless, unrelenting salt of the sea. The sea is restless tonight. Waves slap against the hull with a steady, menacing rhythm, and the Nar creaks and groans like a tired old beast. You're huddled against the mast, wrapped in a damp woolen cloak that does little to keep out the chill. The wind howls, cutting through the night like a blade. But it's not the cold or the noise that's keeping you awake, it's the gnawing, empty ache in your stomach. Tonight's meal? Dried meat. Again. You reach into the wooden chest beside you and pull out a slab of smoked reindeer. It's blackened and shriveled, tough as old leather. You gnaw on a corner, jaw working tirelessly to break through the sinewy flesh. The taste is intense, salty, smoky, with a faint hint of char. It's almost too much. But you force it down, bite after bite, because it's better than going to sleep hungry. Dried meat is a Viking sailor's lifeline. Before setting sail, the crew would slaughter whatever livestock they could spare, reindeer, goats, horses, and smoke the meat over open fires. Smoke, like salt, is a powerful preservative. It seals in moisture, prevents rot, and infuses the meat with that strong, almost acrid flavor that sticks to the back of your throat. But out here, day after day, that flavor starts to feel less like food and more like punishment. You look around and see your shipmates chewing grimly, faces gaunt and pale in the moonlight. One man picks at his teeth with a fishbone, his eyes staring blankly at the sea. Another gnaws on a strip of dried pork, his jaw moving rhythmically as if he's forgotten how to stop. As you chew, your mind drifts to the old tales. They say that during especially long voyages, when food supplies dwindled and desperation set in, the Vikings would resort to eating walrus blubber. Thick, greasy, and dense with fat, the blubber was a last resort, an emergency ration that could keep a man alive but would leave him queasy for days. You've never had to eat walrus blubber, but you've heard stories. Stories of men doubled over in pain, clutching their bellies as the rancid, oily mass churned in their guts. Stories of sailors losing control, vomiting over the side as the ship rocked beneath them. You close your eyes and try not to think about it, focusing instead on the meat between your teeth. Beside you, Eric is busy hacking away at a dried reindeer leg with his knife. The meat is so hard it's almost petrified, and each slice sends little flakes of charred fat scattering to the deck. He pops a piece into his mouth and chews, jaw working like a millstone. "Remember back home?" he says, voice muffled by the meat. "Roasted lamb. Fresh out of the fire. So tender it fell off the bone." You grunt in response, too busy chewing to answer. The meat is sticking to your molars, and every swallow feels like you're choking down a mouthful of sand. But Eric isn't done. "And bread," he continues, his eyes distant and unfocused. "Not this dry, sawdust sconbrod. I mean real bread. The kind your mother makes. Thick crust. Soft inside. Spread with fresh butter and honey." You close your eyes, the memory almost painful. You can almost taste it, the sweet, rich butter melting on your tongue, the warm, pillowy bread soaking up every drop. But then the ship lurches, and the fantasy shatters like glass. Eric curses, grabbing for the mast to steady himself. You do the same, heart pounding as the Nar pitches violently to one side. The wind has picked up, whipping through the sails and sending icy spray flying over the deck. You pull your cloak tighter, teeth chattering as the cold sinks in. Your dried meat falls from your hand, sliding across the deck and disappearing into the darkness. You swear under your breath, but it's no use. The meat is gone, lost to the sea. The captain appears, moving quickly through the chaos. He's clutching a wooden bucket filled with chunks of seal fat, tossing them to the men as he passes. The fat is raw, greasy, and slightly rancid, but it's rich in calories and can keep a man going even in the worst conditions. You catch a chunk and bite down, the fat squishing between your teeth like oily clay. It's disgusting. But it's food. Eric swallows his piece with a grimace, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "When we get back," he mutters, "I'm going to eat an entire pig. Roasted. With apples in its mouth. And ale. Enough ale to drown a man." You nod, forcing yourself to swallow the last of the seal fat. The taste clings to your tongue, heavy and slick. You wipe your mouth and settle back against the mast, eyes drifting shut as the ship rocks beneath you. But sleep doesn't come easily. Not with the wind howling like a banshee, and the taste of salt, smoke, and rancid fat still lingering in your mouth. The air is thick with the scent of salt and sweat. You sit cross-legged on the damp wooden deck, staring down at a bowl of rehydrated peas. The water sloshes lazily around the shriveled green orbs, which have plumped up just enough to look like they might be edible. But you know better. You've had these peas before. You take a spoonful and lift it to your mouth. The peas are rubbery and bland, with the texture of wet paper. You chew, the taste of musty, stale water coating your tongue. You swallow, wincing as the lump slides down your throat like a stone. Across the deck, Eric makes a face, poking at his own bowl with a wooden spoon. Not exactly a feast, he mutters, shoving another spoonful into his mouth. You nod in agreement. Dried peas are one of the few vegetables that can survive a long sea voyage. Unlike fresh produce, which rots within days, these peas have been dried and stored in burlap sacks, packed tightly to keep out moisture and rodents. Before eating, they're soaked in water to make them chewable again, but no amount of soaking can bring back the taste of fresh peas. You glance at the barrel beside you, where more dried vegetables are stored. There are turnips, carrots, even some onions, though they're shriveled up like old fingers and smell faintly of mildew. The crew is rationing them carefully, saving them for special occasions or when morale dips dangerously low. You take another spoonful of peas, forcing yourself to chew slowly. The trick, you've learned, is to imagine that they're fresh. Picture a lush, green field back in Norway, the peas still clinging to their vines, crisp and sweet from the sun. But as soon as you open your eyes, the illusion dissolves, and all you're left with is a bowl of waterlogged mush. Historians still argue whether Viking sailors had access to herbs and spices, Eric says, scraping the bottom of his bowl. Some say they brought dried dill or garlic. Others say it was just salt and smoke. You stare into your empty bowl, licking the last few grains of pea pulp from the rim. Spices. You remember the taste of wild garlic, how your mother used to crush it and mix it with goat cheese. Or the sharp, peppery taste of horseradish, grated over roasted venison. Out here, the only spice is salt, and even that's in short supply. Think we'll catch anything today? One of the younger sailors asks, glancing over the side of the ship. A crude fishing line dangles in the water, a hunk of dried meat tied to the end as bait. The sea is choppy, the water dark and restless. Not ideal conditions for fishing. Not likely, Eric grunts, tossing his bowl aside. Fish know better than to come near us. But fishing is a necessary gamble on these voyages. When the food stores run low, the crew will throw lines overboard, hoping for a bite. Cod, haddock, and mackerel are the most common catches, though on rougher days, even a slimy jellyfish starts to look like a decent meal. You watch as the line bobs in the water, jerking slightly with every wave. Minutes pass. The wind picks up, howling through the rigging. You wrap your arms around yourself, feeling the cold bite through your cloak. Your stomach grumbles, a dull, aching reminder that you haven't eaten anything substantial in days. Finally, the line goes taut. The young sailor shouts, yanking it up with both hands. A silver flash breaks the surface, a fish, flapping wildly, its scales glistening in the pale light. The crew rushes over, eyes bright with hunger. It's a decent size, enough to feed 3 or 4 men, if they're careful. Someone guts the fish right there on the deck, the knife slicing cleanly through flesh and bone. The scent of raw fish mingles with the salt air, sharp and briny. The meat is divided into thin strips, which are then hung over the side of the ship to dry in the wind. It'll take hours before it's ready to eat, but at least it's something. Meanwhile, you sit back down, the taste of dried peas still lingering in your mouth. You close your eyes, leaning against the mast as the ship rocks beneath you. In your mind, you imagine the fish sizzling over an open fire, the skin crisping, the meat flaking apart with each bite. You can almost smell it, the rich, savory aroma filling the air. But when you open your eyes, the only thing filling the air is the scent of mildew, salt, and the endless, aching hunger that gnaws at you from within. The wind howls again, a constant companion on this endless journey. The ship creaks and sways as the sails strain against their ropes, the sound of the rigging snapping in the breeze like 1,000 tiny whips. You sit hunched over on the deck, your knees pulled up to your chest. The sun is barely visible through the thick clouds, a faint golden disk suspended in the gray sky. There's something about the monotony of this journey that starts to seep into your bones, making the days feel like they're stretching into eternity. You can't quite remember what it felt like to stand on solid land, to walk on grass, to feel the warmth of a hearth fire. Even the smell of smoke and salt seems to blend into one, leaving your senses dulled and distant. But there's one thing you can always rely on, something that brings a tiny flicker of comfort in this otherwise uncomfortable existence: rations of dried fish. It's not much, but it's more than enough to stave off the worst of your hunger. And unlike the peas, which leave your stomach feeling hollow, the dried fish has substance. You pull out your ration for the day, a thin strip of dried cod, and tear off a piece with your teeth. The texture is tough but manageable, and the salty, fishy flavor fills your mouth. You chew slowly, savoring the small pleasure. It's not a feast by any means, but at least it's familiar. Most of the crew are eating the same thing, though not everyone is as enthusiastic about it as you. The dried cod, often preserved in salt, has a distinct taste, sharp and briny, and after weeks at sea, it becomes a constant presence in your diet. The fish is tough, almost leathery, and each bite feels like a small, salty battle. But you can't complain. It's better than the alternatives, which are too grim to even consider. The crew members who can't handle the dried cod try to make do with whatever they can catch. The fishing lines are out again today, and there's a sense of hope among the men that today might be the day they catch a real feast. The sea is unpredictable, though.
One day, you might reel in a whole school of fish, enough to feed everyone for days.
The next, you might catch nothing but a few crabs and some seaweed. Still, the thought of fresh fish is a welcome fantasy, one that keeps you going even when the gnawing hunger starts to get unbearable. Historians still argue whether the Vikings truly relied on fish as their primary protein source during long sea voyages, or whether they supplemented their diet with other sources of food, like wild game or sea mammals. Some believe that, due to the lack of refrigeration, the Vikings would have prioritized salted fish as a reliable protein that could last the entire journey. Others suggest that fish may have been just one part of a more varied diet, with the sailors hunting or foraging as they made their way across the seas. Whatever the case, dried fish was certainly a staple for Viking seafarers. The preservation process was simple but effective. After being caught, the fish would be gutted, salted, and dried. Salt was especially important for preservation, drawing moisture out of the flesh to prevent it from rotting. The fish would then be stored in barrels or sacks, and carried along on the long voyages that sometimes stretched for months. The men would gnaw on the dried strips, sometimes breaking them into smaller pieces and soaking them in seawater to soften them up. But even then, the fish remained tough and salty. After a particularly long stretch of days without fresh food, you start to think that maybe the fresh fish isn't so much a luxury as a necessity. Without it, you might start to feel the weight of the journey even more acutely. Already, your bones ache from the constant rocking of the ship, and your mind feels distant, like you're drifting in a fog. But for now, the dried cod will have to do. You finish your ration, scraping the last bits of salt from the corner of your mouth. The ship groans beneath you, and you lean back against the mast, gazing at the waves stretching endlessly before you. You're no longer certain whether it's the sea, the food, or the isolation that's wearing you down, but you're growing used to it. The hunger, the exhaustion, the cold, it all becomes part of the rhythm of life on the sea. Eric is nearby, inspecting the fishing line again, though his hope seems to be fading. The fish, elusive as always, refuse to cooperate. He shrugs and settles down beside you, pulling a chunk of dried reindeer from his pack. "Tomorrow," he says softly, tearing into the tough meat. "Maybe tomorrow we'll catch something worth celebrating." You nod, though you're not sure you believe him. Tomorrow feels like a distant dream, one that's always just beyond your reach. But still, you cling to it. Just like you cling to the taste of dried cod in your mouth, the memory of fresh fish, and the thought of land somewhere out there on the horizon. And so, the days stretch on, each one a blur of salt and wind, hunger and longing. You know the journey isn't over yet, but with every passing moment, you grow a little stronger. After all, there's one thing the Vikings understood better than anyone else: endurance. The sea may be unforgiving, the food scarce, but you will keep moving forward, one bite at a time. The ship rocks with the rhythm of the waves, and you brace yourself against the mast, your hands gripping the rough wood. The horizon is a blur of mist and ocean, the same endless stretch of gray that's been with you for what feels like weeks. The smell of brine is thick in the air, mixing with the faint scent of fish and dried herbs. You catch a glimpse of the sky, which has started to darken. It's late in the day now, and the promise of dusk hangs heavily over the water. Your stomach growls, reminding you of the last meager meal, a few pieces of dried fish and a handful of soggy peas. It's barely enough to keep you going, but there's no choice but to push forward. You glance over at the other sailors, who are doing their best to ignore the gnawing emptiness in their bellies. Some are working with the fishing lines, while others sit hunched over in the shadows, nursing their own hunger. At least there's one small comfort. Tonight, you're supposed to have a bit of fresh bread. The bread is a rare treat, a luxury that's only brought out when the captain feels generous. It's made from the last of the flour, which has been carefully rationed throughout the journey. The bread isn't anything like the soft loaves you remember from home. It's dense, heavy, and dry, and it's more like a brick than a loaf. But when you've been living on dried fish and peas for weeks, even the hardest, driest bread feels like a gift. As you sit back against the hull of the ship, you catch sight of one of the sailors, a burly man with a thick beard, preparing the bread. He slices it carefully, though you can see the deep weariness in his eyes. Each slice is a small piece of the dwindling supply, and everyone knows it won't last much longer. "Don't get too excited," Eric mutters, wiping the sweat from his brow. "It'll be gone before we know it." You can't help but agree. The bread, though a momentary reprieve, is just one more fragile thread in the web of your survival. The ship will continue to rock and sway beneath you, and the days will stretch out, one after another, until you lose count of time. You wonder if, in another life, you would have been back home in the fields of Norway, tending to the goats and gathering fresh bread from the hearth. But for now, all you can do is endure. The bread is passed around, and you take your slice with a mix of anticipation and trepidation. The edges are hard, and the center is dry, but you tear off a piece anyway. The crumbs fall into your lap, and you can already feel the dullness of the bread drying out your mouth. It's no feast. But for a moment, as you chew slowly, you can almost pretend you're sitting at a table in a warm house, a hot meal waiting before you. But the illusion fades quickly, replaced by the harsh reality of the ship. The wind is picking up again, and the waves are growing higher, slapping against the sides of the ship with greater force. You finish the bread, wiping your hands on your tunic and glancing at the other sailors. Some are talking quietly, others are staring out at the horizon, their minds clearly elsewhere. The thought of returning to land, to see solid earth once more, is almost too much to bear. But the bread is gone now, and the hunger still lingers, like a persistent ache that won't go away. You feel it deep in your bones, a reminder of the days spent drifting on the sea. Even the bread, which for a moment seemed like a luxury, doesn't quite satisfy the emptiness that's grown inside you. Historians still argue about the role of bread in Viking diets. Some suggest that the Vikings didn't rely on it as heavily as other cultures, preferring instead to eat a mix of fish, meat, and root vegetables. Others believe that bread, made from barley, oats, or rye, was a more prominent part of their diet, especially on long sea voyages where other sources of food were hard to come by. Whatever the case, the bread you eat today is a far cry from the fresh loaves that would have been baked in the warm hearts of Viking homes. At the very least, you think, it's something. As night begins to settle over the ship, you pull your cloak tighter around you, the warmth of the bread still lingering on your tongue. The crew is quieter now, the low murmur of voices replaced by the sound of the wind and the waves. Someone hums a song, and another joins in, the melody soft and haunting against the backdrop of the sea. For a moment, you close your eyes, the gentle sway of the ship lulling you into a kind of trance. The hunger is still there, gnawing at you from the inside, but it doesn't seem so unbearable now. The bread, however small, has done its work. It's a reminder that, for all the harshness of the journey, there are moments, however fleeting, when you're reminded of what it means to survive. And survive you will. The night is growing colder now. The moon is a pale sliver, barely visible behind the clouds, and the wind is picking up in intensity. You can feel the chill creeping into your bones, despite the thick wool of your tunic. The ship creaks and groans as the waves slam into its hull, and you can't help but feel the weight of the journey pressing down on you once again. The endless water, the endless hunger, the endless waiting. Sometimes, it feels like the only constant on this voyage is the cold. But there's one thing that helps keep the cold at bay, if only for a little while: warm porridge. When the cold really starts to bite, the crew gathers around the small, smoky fire in the center of the ship. The captain has agreed to cook up some porridge for the men, a welcome change from the dried fish and stale bread. The porridge is simple, made from barley or oats, and it's cooked with a bit of water and maybe a splash of milk if there's any left. Sometimes, there's a sprinkle of salt or honey to give it flavor. It's not much, but it's filling, and for a moment, it makes you feel almost human again. You sit with the others around the fire, the warmth of the flames doing its best to counter the biting cold of the sea. The porridge is thick and hearty, and you spoon it into your mouth, savoring the soft, comforting texture. The taste is plain, but that's part of the charm. It's simple, humble, and just what you need to get through the long nights. The other men seem to appreciate it, too. Some are laughing softly, the camaraderie of shared food lightening the mood, if only for a short time. Others are more reserved, their faces pinched with fatigue, but even they can't help but appreciate the warmth the porridge brings. For a moment, you all sit together, eating in silence, the only sounds being the occasional slurp and the crackle of the fire. You think about how different life must have been for the Vikings back home in the villages, where the cold could be kept at bay by a warm hearth and plenty of food. There, a meal like this would have been a comforting routine, not a rarity. But on the ship, out here on the vast, empty sea, a bowl of porridge feels like a small treasure. It's proof that, despite the hardships, there are still moments of comfort to be found, even in the most unlikely places. As you finish your bowl, you feel the warmth spread through your body, and for the first time in a while, you allow yourself to relax. It's a fleeting feeling, but it's enough to keep you going. You've learned to appreciate these small comforts, even if they're temporary. You never know when the next meal will come, or when the sea will change its mood and make life even harder. But tonight, at least, you have the porridge. And for now, that's enough. Historians still debate the Viking diet, particularly the role of porridge in their meals. It's clear that grains like barley, oats, and rye were commonly consumed, both in solid forms and as part of stews or porridge. Some sources suggest that porridge was a staple breakfast for Viking families, eaten regularly to start the day. The Vikings, after all, needed the energy to endure long days of hard work, whether it was on the ship or on land. It's also worth noting that porridge wasn't always made with sweet ingredients like honey. In fact, the Vikings were more likely to eat it plain or with salt, depending on what ingredients were available. In lean times, porridge would have been a practical, no-frills meal, filling and inexpensive. In more prosperous times, it might have been sweetened with honey or served with berries or fruits, though these would have been rare delicacies. You take a deep breath, the warmth of the porridge settling in your stomach. The fire crackles softly in the background, and the hum of the ship's movement lulls you into a peaceful state. The hunger pangs are still there, lurking in the corners of your mind, but for a while, they're easy to ignore. As the night deepens, you settle down on the deck again, wrapping yourself in your cloak. The wind is fierce now, but you try to ignore it. There's a softness to the air as the sea rocks you gently, and you close your eyes, letting the rhythmic motion of the ship lull you to sleep. Tomorrow, the journey will continue. But tonight, at least, you have warmth. You have comfort. And you have the knowledge that, no matter how cold the sea may get, the Vikings have always known how to survive, one small meal at a time. The wind howls through the rigging, snapping the sails taut as the ship battles its way through the storm. You grip the rail tightly, bracing against the cold gusts that bite into your skin like shards of ice. The sky above is an unrelenting gray, dark clouds swirling in a furious dance, and the sea beneath you roils like an angry beast. This storm feels different, it's bigger, fiercer, and the waves seem to tower over the ship. You can see the other men struggling to keep the ship steady, their faces grim and determined as they fight the elements. But through all the chaos, one thing remains unchanged: the food supplies. You've already finished your small ration of dried fish and flatbread for the day, and the hunger gnaws at your gut as the storm continues to rage. There's no telling when you'll get another chance to eat, or if the provisions will even last long enough to see the end of this voyage. But there's something else that's become a staple for the crew during times like these: dried meat. The Vikings were known for their skill in preserving food, particularly meat, for long journeys like this one. The harsh conditions of the sea meant that fresh food wouldn't last long, so dried and salted meats were essential to survival. Whether it was salted beef, pork, or dried fish, these preserved meats could be kept for months, even years, without spoiling. On the ship, dried meat was often the go-to meal, especially during storms like the one you're facing now. The captain orders a portion of dried meat to be passed around, and you find yourself clutching a small piece of the tough, salt-encrusted meat. The texture is tough, almost rubbery, but it's salty and satisfying. You chew slowly, savoring the rare moment of sustenance in a world that seems intent on taking everything from you. The other men around you don't seem to mind the toughness of the meat. They've all grown used to it over the years. It's a meal that doesn't require much preparation, just tear off a chunk, chew, and swallow. Simple, efficient, and it fills the stomach. The taste is strong, the saltiness cutting through the dryness of your mouth, but it's a comfort nonetheless. The hunger, at least, is quieted for a while. You think about how the Vikings would have cured their meats. Often, they would salt and smoke the meat, using the drying process to preserve it against the elements. The smoke also helped to add flavor, making even the most basic cuts of meat seem like a luxury. The preserved meat wasn't just about survival, it was a reflection of the Vikings' resourcefulness, their ability to adapt to the demands of their harsh environment. But it wasn't just about practical preservation. The Vikings had a strong cultural connection to meat, especially when it came to feasts. After a successful raid or during festivals, meat would be prepared in large quantities, and the Vikings would indulge in hearty, meaty meals, often accompanied by ale or mead. But on the ship, in the middle of a storm, it was just a reminder that survival came at a cost. The dried meat is a fleeting comfort, though. As soon as the last piece is gone, the hunger creeps back in, and you're left with nothing but the roar of the wind and the crashing of waves. But for a moment, at least, you've managed to stave off the worst of it. You can hear the other men muttering softly, a few sharing a joke, others lost in their thoughts, staring out at the dark, tumultuous sea. The storm is far from over, but at least you're still here, still alive, and still fighting. Historians still argue whether the Vikings preferred dried meat over other preserved foods like fish or cheese. While fish was certainly a staple in their diet, the harsh conditions of sea voyages often meant that meat, especially salted beef or pork, became the primary source of sustenance. There are also records suggesting that Vikings would sometimes eat meat with grains like barley or oats, combining the two to create hearty stews or porridges. The key, of course, was preservation. Food had to last, and the Vikings knew how to make it last. As you finish the last of your dried meat, you take another deep breath, the salty air filling your lungs. The storm is still raging, but it feels a little more manageable now, a little less overwhelming. You wonder how much longer it will last, and whether you'll make it through without losing anyone. But for now, you focus on the small victories, the bread, the porridge, the dried meat, those moments when you're reminded that even in the most difficult of times, survival is possible. You sit back down on the wet, rocking deck, trying to find a moment of rest in the chaos. The storm has become a distant hum, the sound of the ship's timbers creaking and groaning against the waves. You close your eyes, and for a moment, you can almost imagine that you're back home, sitting by the fire with a warm meal before you. But the ship rocks again, and the moment is gone. The storm has passed, and now, a stillness settles over the ship like a heavy blanket. The wind that had whipped around you, relentless and furious, is now but a whisper. The waves are calmer, though the sea is far from friendly. The ship creaks and sways gently, as if it too is exhausted from the storm's fury. It's eerily quiet, the only sounds the soft lap of water against the hull and the occasional creaking of the wooden planks. As you sit there, trying to get a few moments of rest, your thoughts wander to the other challenge of the journey, thirst. While food on the ship has always been a matter of careful planning and resourcefulness, the issue of fresh water is just as critical. The Vikings, being a seafaring people, understood the importance of fresh water. Without it, the crew wouldn't last long, no matter how much dried meat or porridge they had. Freshwater sources were hard to come by when you're out at sea, so the Vikings had a unique solution. They relied on barrels of fresh water, which were stored on board in large casks. But those weren't always enough to last through a long voyage. The reality of the situation was that fresh water on a Viking ship was a precious commodity. Water was rationed carefully, and everyone knew that one misstep or one day of poor management could leave the crew desperately thirsty in the middle of the ocean. But despite the careful planning, there were times when the water ran low. In these desperate moments, the Vikings would turn to another option, seawater. It wasn't ideal, of course. The salty, briny water was undrinkable on its own, but desperate times called for desperate measures. Historians have debated how often the Vikings actually drank seawater, but it seems likely that in some situations, they would use it in small quantities, perhaps diluting it with fresh water or using it for brief sips to stave off dehydration. On long voyages, however, seawater was more of a last resort. The Vikings were far too resourceful to rely on something so dangerous for long periods. They knew that the salt would eventually dehydrate them even further, leading to severe illness or even death. Still, in moments of extreme thirst, it was an option that, while unpleasant, might just have been necessary. For the most part, the crew was cautious with the water they had, rationing it out carefully, and making sure everyone received their fair share. The fresh water that had been carefully stored in barrels was the first priority, but when that ran low, the men would begin to share the seawater, hoping that the small amount would hold them over until they could find land again. While water on the ship was often in short supply, there were other ways to keep your thirst at bay, though they weren't always ideal. On particularly long voyages, the crew might be forced to rely on the moisture from food, particularly the porridge and fish they had brought with them. Both foods contained a certain amount of water, and while it wasn't enough to fully hydrate you, it was something to help ease the worst of the thirst. The Vikings were no strangers to discomfort, though. They'd been raised to endure hardship, and on these voyages, they learned just how far their endurance could stretch. Thirst was just another challenge to overcome, another test of their survival instincts. They had no choice but to keep pushing forward, using whatever means they had available to sustain themselves until they reached land again. Historians still debate how the Vikings were able to store their water for long trips. Some believe they used wooden barrels, while others suggest that they might have stored water in leather bags. Some even speculate that they had special techniques for sealing the barrels to ensure the water stayed fresh for longer. Whatever the method, it's clear that the Vikings were keenly aware of the importance of water, and they did what they could to ensure they had enough for the journey. As you sit back, trying to gather what little strength you can from the stillness around you, you feel the thirst creep back into your body. It's not as overwhelming as hunger, but it's constant, like a dry itch that can never quite be scratched. You reach for your water skin, hoping that there's still something left. You take a small sip, and the coolness is a relief, but it's only a brief one. You'll have to wait until you can get to land before you truly feel quenched again. But you take solace in knowing that, as uncomfortable as it may be, this too shall pass. The Vikings knew that survival wasn't about having everything you wanted, it was about making do with what you had. The same is true now. The thirst will fade, the journey will continue, and one day, you'll find yourself on solid ground again. Until then, you hold on to the small victories, the warmth of the fire, the bread, the porridge, the shared moments of camaraderie with the men around you. These little comforts are what keep you going, and they're enough for now. The stillness of the sea persists as you begin to find your rhythm again on the ship. The occasional ripple in the water is a reminder that nature is still out there, moving around you, but for now, the storm has passed, and the dangers of the deep feel far away. But while the weather may have calmed, you can't afford to let your guard down completely. There's still the matter of what to eat next. Dried meat and salted fish have been your constant companions, but there's another staple that the Vikings often relied on: grains. Grains were a versatile, long-lasting food source, and they played an important role in the diet of a seafaring Viking. The Vikings didn't just rely on meat, they knew how to make use of other foods that could be easily stored and preserved for the long voyages ahead. Barley was the most common grain they would bring along, as it was hardy and could withstand the rigors of sea travel. Barley could be used in many ways: roasted, ground into flour for bread, or boiled into a hearty porridge. It was often mixed with water or milk, sometimes with a bit of honey for sweetness, making it both filling and nutritious. It wasn't fancy food, but it provided the energy needed for long days of sailing. But the grain-based meals weren't just about survival, they also served a practical purpose for the crew. When the weather was calm, they could use the time to cook up a simple grain porridge, a meal that could be shared among the men. It wasn't much, but it was something to break up the monotony of the journey. The porridge was often a comforting reminder of home. It was simple food, but for the Vikings, it was a vital source of nourishment. The soft texture of the warm porridge was soothing on your stomach, especially after a long day of hard work on the ship. It was a meal that didn't require much preparation, and it didn't spoil easily, making it perfect for long voyages. Historians still debate how often the Vikings would have eaten grain-based meals during their travels. Some believe that they would have consumed grain-based foods more often than we give them credit for, considering the difficulty of storing fresh produce on long trips. Others argue that meat was the primary source of nutrition on Viking voyages and that grain-based meals were more of a supplement. What's clear, however, is that grains played an important role in sustaining the crew, especially during periods when fresh food was in short supply. There was also the matter of the bread. The Vikings were skilled bakers, and they would often bake flatbreads that could be easily stored for the journey. The bread was dense, hard, and tough, much like the dried meat, but it had its own kind of satisfaction. When you took a bite, you could feel the rough texture on your teeth, the weight of the bread settling in your stomach, offering a small comfort in an otherwise difficult journey. The bread would often be dipped in the stew or porridge to soften it, making it easier to chew and digest. But bread wasn't always a luxury. On occasion, it would go stale, especially if the weather had been particularly harsh. You could break a piece off and gnaw on it, but it would take some effort. The Vikings were used to such hardships, and it wasn't uncommon for them to eat stale, dry bread without much thought. After all, it was still food, and in the wild, that was something to be grateful for. In a way, the simplicity of these meals served as a reminder of the Viking mindset. They didn't focus on fancy feasts or indulgent meals. Their food was about function, about survival, and about sustaining themselves long enough to complete the journey. There was no room for frivolousness when you were out on the open sea. But that didn't mean they didn't enjoy their food. While meals were often simple, there was still room for small pleasures. The warmth of a shared meal, the comfort of the bread, and the satisfaction of a filling porridge, all these things brought the crew together. It was a reminder that, despite the roughness of the voyage, they were still a family of sorts, bound together by their shared struggles. As you sit on the deck, with a bowl of porridge in hand, you take a moment to savor the warmth of the meal. It's not much, but it's enough to get you through the day. The soft steam rises from the bowl, and you can feel the heat radiating against your hands. The grains, simple as they are, offer a kind of solace, a small but significant victory in a world that often feels overwhelming. You glance around at the other men, some of them already finishing their meals, others still picking at their portions. Despite the roughness of the journey, there's a sense of camaraderie in the air. It's not the kind of companionship you'd find around a grand feast, but it's real, born out of necessity and shared experience. These men are your family for the duration of the journey, and in moments like this, when you're all gathered together, there's a sense of peace amidst the chaos. And as you finish the last of your porridge, you know that this, too, shall pass. The waves will settle, the journey will continue, and eventually, you'll find land. Until then, the porridge, the bread, and the grains will keep you going, and you'll keep pushing forward, together. The ship sails steadily now, the rhythm of the waves underneath you almost lulling you to sleep as you gaze out at the vast horizon. The endless stretch of water seems almost peaceful at first, but you know better. The sea is a fickle mistress. At any moment, the storm could return, the winds could shift, and the waves could rise up once again. But for now, the quiet is a blessing, and the only sound is the creaking of the ship's wood as it moves with the tide. It's hard to believe that not so long ago, you were bracing against the fury of nature, fighting against the harsh winds and the crashing waves. Now, the sun is out, and it feels like everything might just be okay. But that doesn't mean you can afford to relax completely. On a Viking ship, there's always work to be done, always something to prepare for. Even when the sea is calm, the crew is always busy. As the hours pass, you can't help but notice the small details of life aboard the ship. The way the sailors work together, passing supplies and adjusting sails, their movements synchronized like a well-oiled machine. They've done this countless times before, and they know exactly what to do, when to do it, and how to do it. But it's not just the physical labor that occupies their time. There's also the matter of the food and the need to stay alert and nourished. One of the less glamorous but crucial parts of a Viking sailor's diet was the humble fish. While dried meats and grains were essential, fish was a constant source of nutrition on these voyages. And, unlike the preserved meats or grains, fish was often caught fresh, providing a welcome change to the more monotonous food stores. Fish, of course, was a common staple for the Vikings. They fished in rivers, lakes, and coastal waters, and while some larger expeditions might venture out farther to fish on the open sea, most of the fish consumed on board would have come from more easily accessible locations. During long voyages, this was even more important, as catching fresh fish ensured a valuable source of protein, keeping the crew healthy and energized for the long journey ahead. But fish wasn't always available, and in some cases, you could go days without catching anything at all. The weather, the tides, and the skills of the fishermen all had an impact on the crew's ability to catch enough to feed everyone. When things went well, though, the fish would be a prized catch. In fact, the Vikings were known for their skill in catching fish, whether it was through traditional fishing techniques or more innovative methods. There are accounts of the Vikings using large nets, hooks, and lines to catch fish, but one of the more interesting techniques they might have used involved the use of a spear. This was particularly effective in shallow waters, where the fish were often easier to spot. The spear was a familiar tool for the Vikings, not just for hunting on land, but also for catching fish. There's something poetic about how they could use the same weapon to hunt for both meat and fish, something so deeply ingrained in their way of life that it seemed second nature. In some cases, fresh fish would be consumed immediately, cooked on a fire or roasted over coals. Other times, the fish would be salted and dried, preserving it for the long haul. Dried fish, much like salted meat, had the advantage of lasting for months, making it a valuable food source that could be relied upon during the leaner periods of the voyage. Historians still debate the specific role of fish in the Viking diet. Some suggest that it was a minor supplement to the overall diet, used occasionally when available but not relied upon heavily. Others argue that fish was a staple, particularly in the diets of those living near the coast, and that it played a much more significant role in Viking nutrition than is often acknowledged. What's clear is that fish wasn't just food, it was a symbol of the Vikings' connection to the sea, their ability to survive in an unforgiving world. Whether it was fresh fish on a calm day or salted fish on a stormy night, it was a reminder that no matter the challenges, the Vikings were always able to adapt, always able to make do with what they had. The fish was just one part of a greater picture, a testament to the resourcefulness and tenacity of a people who lived and thrived on the edge of the world. As you look out across the water, you see the dark silhouette of a seabird flying overhead. It's a reminder that the sea is always alive, always full of opportunity and danger in equal measure. You can't help but feel a small sense of pride. No matter what comes next, you know you'll find a way to make it through. You've learned the ways of the sea, and with each passing day, you become more and more like the Vikings who have sailed these waters before you, resourceful, resilient, and unyielding in the face of hardship. The ship glides smoothly over the water, and you take a deep breath, knowing that with each passing day, the journey becomes a little more manageable. The fish may be gone, but the camaraderie remains, and in the end, that's what will get you through. The days drift by in a comfortable routine. The sea remains calm, and while the monotonous creak of the ship's wood against the waves can lull you into a near dreamlike state, there is always work to be done. The smell of the ocean air mixes with the sense of food cooking over small fires on deck, and for once, there's an unusual sense of peace, at least for the moment. The crew is focused, each man absorbed in his task, and the sound of their conversations blends with the wind. Still, life on the open sea can be grueling. Even when the food supply is steady, there are moments when the daily grind weighs on the crew. The constant rolling of the ship, the sun burning overhead, and the occasional cold splash of seawater crashing over the bow, all these things start to take a toll. It's during these moments that food becomes more than just sustenance. It becomes a source of comfort, a way to hold on to some sense of normalcy. And it's in these quieter moments, when the ship is no longer battling the waves, that the Vikings find themselves looking forward to something simple, bread. But not just any bread, this bread was something a bit special, something that stood out amidst the simple, utilitarian meals. Rye was another staple in the Viking diet, especially when they could get their hands on it. Rye bread was denser and more filling than barley bread, and it had a distinct flavor that many Vikings grew fond of. Rye's ability to grow in colder climates made it particularly valuable for northern seafarers who faced harsh winters and limited growing seasons. As the ship sailed through the cold northern seas, rye could be prepared, baked, and dried to create a hearty loaf that lasted for months. The rye bread was often thick and hearty, a far cry from the fluffy loaves you might encounter today. It would be dense, almost heavy, and more filling than anything you'd expect to find on a long voyage. And although it may not have been the kind of bread you would dream about on a lazy afternoon, it had a special kind of appeal. There was something about its rustic texture, its firm bite, that brought a sense of comfort when nothing else seemed quite so reliable. You take a bite of the rye bread, feeling the slight graininess of it against your teeth. It's not the soft, warm loaf that you might find in a cozy village bakery, but it does the job. There's a sense of satisfaction in the simplicity of it, the way the bread absorbs the flavor of the fish stew or porridge it's served with, the way it pairs perfectly with a bit of cheese, the way it makes you feel full without being overly indulgent. This is bread that knows its purpose. Historians still debate the specific ways rye bread would have been prepared by the Vikings, with some suggesting that the bread may have been leavened using sourdough or other techniques, while others claim it was more likely to have been flat and unleavened, similar to the thick, rustic loaves that are sometimes found in medieval recipes. Some even argue that rye was used primarily for porridge or gruel, with bread being a secondary consideration. Regardless, the rye bread played a role in Viking nutrition, especially when the crew needed something hearty and filling to get them through the cold and grueling days at sea. The bread wasn't just fuel, it was an essential part of the Viking way of life. The hearty loaves provided both nourishment and a sense of continuity, a tie to the lands they came from. Rye bread was a food that could withstand the elements, just like the Vikings themselves. It was durable, unpretentious, and able to withstand the long voyages. Even when the fish were scarce or the meat supplies ran low, the bread was a reliable companion, always there to keep you going. As you chew the dense bread, you feel a moment of satisfaction, a quiet acknowledgement of the hard work it took to make this journey possible. You think about the generations of sailors who sailed these same waters, relying on the same foods to get them through. Rye bread, dried fish, and salted meat, these were the foods that fueled the Viking Age, the foods that kept the crews going through storm and calm, through winter and summer, through the endless, unforgiving sea. The crew has gathered around, and you share a quiet moment of camaraderie as the bread and stew are passed around. There's no need for extravagant feasts here, no need for lavish meals. The simple act of sharing food, of sustaining each other, is enough. You're reminded once again that survival on the open sea is about more than just the food itself. It's about the bond between the crew, the shared experience of living on the edge of the world, and the knowledge that you're all in this together. The bread may be hard, but it's a symbol of everything the Vikings stood for: strength, resilience, and the willingness to endure whatever came their way. As the day comes to a close, and the sky turns a deep orange as the sun sets, you find a moment of quiet reflection. There is so much more ahead, but for now, you've found your place in the world, your rhythm within the crew. And with the bread still lingering on your tongue, you can feel the comforting weight of it all, both the food and the journey. Night falls softly over the ship, and the gentle rocking of the boat lulls you into a relaxed state. The stars twinkle high above, and there's a crispness to the air that tells you the night is settling in. The long journey has taken its toll, but there's something reassuring about the steady rhythm of the waves and the feeling that, despite the hardships, you're still here, moving forward. It's during these calm, peaceful moments that you truly begin to appreciate the simple comforts of the journey. The bread has filled your belly, the fish has nourished your body, and there's a feeling of contentment that settles over the crew. The ship has become a home in its own right, a place where every creak and groan of the wood feels familiar, where each sailor's face has become as known to you as your own. The hardships of the journey, endless days of work, rough seas, sleepless nights, have all been woven into the fabric of the crew's life, and now, they feel like a part of the adventure. But as you settle in for the night, your thoughts turn to the next challenge. While the food and supplies might be enough for now, there's always the lingering question of what's to come. The Vikings knew this well, they had a deep understanding of the constant ebb and flow of fortune. One day, you might have all the food and supplies you need, the next, you could be struggling to find enough to get by. Such was the nature of the sea and the Viking way of life. As you close your eyes, you think about the foods that sustained these seafaring peoples. The dried fish, the rye bread, the grain porridge, it all ties together in your mind. The food wasn't just sustenance, it was a reminder of the strength of the Viking spirit, their ability to adapt, survive, and make do with whatever the sea threw at them. And even when supplies were running low, there was always something to fall back on. For the Vikings, food wasn't just about survival, it was about the unbroken connection to their world, their culture, and their people. In the stillness of the night, you can almost hear the distant hum of the crew's quiet conversations, the low murmur of voices sharing stories or discussing the next leg of the journey. The ship sways gently beneath you, the canvas of the sails rustling softly in the breeze. You feel a sense of peace wash over you, a quiet acknowledgement that, though the journey is far from over, you're exactly where you need to be. As you drift into sleep, you can't help but feel the weight of history surrounding you. The Vikings, with their fierce resilience, their unyielding drive to explore and conquer, have left their mark on the world. And now, as you sail with them, living through the same experiences they did, you too are part of that legacy. The food you've eaten, the sea you've crossed, and the bonds you've formed with your fellow sailors, it's all part of the same timeless story. The ship glides across the calm waters, the stars above your head twinkling like tiny beacons of light, guiding you forward. You can hear the occasional splash of fish leaping in the distance, the quiet rhythm of the sea beneath the ship's hull. The steady creak of the wood is a lullaby in itself, gently rocking you closer to sleep. And as the ship sails deeper into the night, you realize that, despite everything, the challenges, the hardships, the never-ending journey, you wouldn't want to be anywhere else. You are part of something far greater than yourself, something ancient and enduring, and you know that the food, the companionship, and the memories you've created along the way will stay with you, carrying you through whatever comes next. Now, you let yourself fall into a deeper slumber, the steady motion of the ship and the sounds of the sea wrapping you in a warm embrace. The journey is long, but for now, it's enough to know that you are surviving, thriving, and living through it all.